So we will probably have some more people trickling in, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I'm going to start just by introducing what this is all about and why we're holding a webinar at 4 in the afternoon, because that's kind of an unusual time for 1000 Friends. You should be seeing my screen, which is a presentation. We're going to go in presentation mode. We will see. Here we go. So for those of you who are new here or unfamiliar with who we are and what we do, I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Susan Gaddert, pronouns she, her. I'm the Community Programs Director at 1000 Friends of Wisconsin. We are an organization that works statewide. We were founded almost 30 years ago. We specialize in land use and transportation, although we fall under the umbrella generally of environmental organizations. And what we do now, our work is focused on looking at the intersection of climate, health, land use, and transportation, especially as that plays out in the built environment. So one of the programs that I run is called Active Wisconsin. That is a coalition of advocates and local leaders from across the state who are dedicated to active transportation. So that's walking, biking, and transit access. We share resources and advocate together. And the best way to keep up with what we are doing and with news from 1000 Friends in general is to sign up to our e-news on the Active Wisconsin website. I send out a newsletter once a month, and I only send out extra ones if there's a special reason, like an upcoming event or webinar. And you can also follow us on social media, which is the bottom here. I'll share out links to everything later. So the reason we're here now is that for almost the last 2 years, 1000 Friends has been running this program called the Community Transportation Academy, which is a free course for people in a community to learn the basics of local transportation planning in their own community, in their city or region. So I will spare all the details about it, but it's basically a mix of in-person and virtual sessions. It's an opportunity to learn about, to build knowledge and develop some problem-solving skills. It's a way to connect people, members of the public, with decision makers in their community and be a little more proactive about some of that public engagement. And the ultimate goal is transportation systems that work better for everyone and that are sustainable and accessible and safe. So we've been running this program for almost 2 years. It started in La Crosse. We took it to Stevens Point. It was in Beloit earlier this year, and it is ongoing now in Kenosha. So where you are right now is in session 6 out of 9. So we are finishing up the second trimester, if you will, of the Kenosha Transportation Academy. So the big yellow star down on the bottom right of the map is where this is taking place. We're looking to bring it to Green Bay next year, and I've done some training to take this to other cities across the Midwest. But just so you have some context for why we're doing this now, the Academy meets every Wednesday from 4 to 6 through the end of October. Last week we had a walk audit and we had beautiful weather for it, which was great. This week we have a new topic in the curriculum. This is not something I've been able to cover so far. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hear from Daniel Harrigus, who is from the Parking Reform Network. They work nationwide. Daniel will tell more about himself, his work, and his organization when I turn it over to him. But we've been covering various topics over the last month and a half, things like regional transportation and rail. We've talked about the history of highway building and housing segregation, how that all plays into the built environment we have now. We've talked about dangerous road design. We're gearing up for a transit tour next week. So we're hitting on a whole lot of different topics, but I think it's going to be really interesting to hear what Daniel has to say about parking and how that impacts like everything else. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over. Oh, sorry, one quick thing. If you have questions, please hold on to them. We'll have plenty of time for those at the end. For now, I've disabled the chat. I may open it back up if that works for people, but just keep in mind that there'll be plenty of time for that after Daniel's presentation. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Susan. I guess I'll get started. I'll just introduce myself and then I'll pull up my slides. My name's Daniel Harrigus. I am the policy director for the Parking Reform Network. We are a national, I guess technically international organization, though almost all of our work is in the US and to a lesser extent Canada. We have members all over the world. Um, and we were founded in 2019 to be sort of the central clearinghouse, the central hub for anyone working on parking reform. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what parking reform is, why it's needed, and what it is that we do. My background is as an urban planner. I was trained in urban planning, and then I went to work for an advocacy organization called Strong Towns for a number of years before moving over to PRN. So I've been in this advocacy realm for a while, and I'm based in Minnesota. I'm in St. Paul. I'm so happy to talk to some fellow Upper Midwesterners. All right, I'm going to put my slide deck up and make sure everybody can see it. Are we good, Susan? Yes, great. Um, all right, and I'm going to talk about the potential for parking reform to improve nearly everything about our cities. PRN's mission, as I said, is to be the hub for the parking reform movement, to build and sustain that movement. And we do that by building community, by being a convener, bringing people together from advocates to practitioners to elected officials, policymakers. We host events, we host webinars, we connect people to each other. We have a very active Slack community and newsletter. Um, we support and disseminate research to help people access the best available information about the status of parking reform, best practices, responses to issues that may arise around local parking policy. And ultimately, we want to kind of organize the organizers. We want to spur people to take action where they live to improve parking policy. The basic problem we're trying to address is that we have too much parking pretty much everywhere in North America. And a lot of that is by law. A lot of that is because we have a pervasive system just about everywhere of arbitrary mandates for set amounts of parking for different land uses. And those mandates are almost everywhere too high. We end up with an excess of parking. No one actually knows how much parking there is in North America. In the United States, estimates range from 3 to 8 parking stalls for every person in the country. Um, but nobody really counts this stuff. And for a long time, there wasn't a lot of policy attention to the trade-offs involved in parking or to the potential downsides. And yet those downsides are myriad. Excessive parking prevents the development of walkable and sustainable and vibrant places.
Sorry
And
to
this,
interrupt you, Daniel. Can you describe the images that are on the
oh yes,
pages
yes,
under
thank
them?
you. Yeah, we have an image here. This is an aerial photo of a suburban area where you've got some housing, you've got some shopping centers and office buildings, but it's an aerial photo where you can see that the majority of the land is really occupied by parking. That surface parking is the dominant land use. And this is true across much of our landscape, and it's something that we don't often think of. But it touches on a huge variety of different concerns. Parking policy is at this interesting intersection where it's very few people's primary issue, but it has implications for environmental issues, for climate impacts, for pollution, runoff. It has implications for traffic congestion. It has implications for the cost and availability of housing. Um, it has implications for access, including for low income and marginalized people, to jobs, to amenities in the city, and the cost of that access. It has implications for private property rights and can you open a business? Can you build homes? Can you do what you want with your land? So people come to the issue from a lot of different angles. And up until PRN was founded in 2019, we don't believe that there was an organization really in our space of trying to be the convener for all those different issues. We find allies all over the place in the parking reform movement. We work with groups advocating for more housing, for affordable housing. We work with developers, walk and bike groups, disability advocates, advocates for The needs of seniors. The AARP has been a longtime partner of ours. Some environmental groups, transit riders unions, tenants organizations. It is really across the map because parking is everywhere and touches on everything. And so we want to be the one-stop shop. And I've got a kind of cheesy AI image here. We got to keep up with emerging technologies here. Illustrating we want to be where you go to learn about parking reform, what it is, why you should care, to connect with people who can answer just about any question you might have. Um, to the extent that there's a parking reform movement, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the debt of that movement to Professor Donald Shoup, who is a professor emeritus at this point at UCLA. Wrote a book published in 2005 originally called The High Cost of Free Parking, and really pioneered the study of all of the various impacts of parking policy that had largely gone overlooked for decades by policymakers. And Shoup's work really helped catalyze a movement that is exploding in its impact, that is now the subject of conversation in city halls, and increasingly state houses all over the country. But I do have to warn you. We have a slide here with an image here. We got a door that's just barely creaking open. You can see some light peeking through. Once you learn about parking reform, you're going to see it everywhere. It's going to bother you. This is an issue that is so niche, but it tends to create obsessives. And I will admit to being one of those. Once you realize just the sheer impact of parking on everything that you want out of the city, you can't stop seeing it. Every time you look at a parking space, you're not going to see it the same way. So we've got this kind of goofy cartoon here, this little meme cartoon, of a guy in the corner of a party. There are some people dancing, and he's looking forlorn and holding a copy of The High Cost of Free Parking. And he's thinking, they don't know about the enormous costs imposed to cities by free parking spaces. Well, we want to turn that guy into this guy who knows that they all know about the enormous costs imposed to cities by parking mandates. If I could boil down what we are advocating for to one sentence, there's a lot more to it than this, but that sentence is cities should mind their own business when it comes to parking. That the first thing we need to do before we do anything else is get out of the way. Where we are in the way is in the form of parking mandates. What are parking mandates? They are tables that can be found in the zoning code of almost any city in America, that stipulate a minimum number of parking spaces that you have to provide on private property, off street, based on the land use or other characteristics of that property. These requirements can be really, really fine-grained, really, really specific, which gives them sort of an air of scientific authority. But what is the origin of these requirements? And the origin is not what people assume when they first encounter them. The origin is essentially we made it up. In the post-World War II era, there was a massive explosion in individual car ownership and driving across America. And unsurprisingly, it created parking problems, especially in older cities that had not been built around the assumption that everyone would have a car. And the planning profession kind of collectively responded by starting to mandate that private property owners provide parking. This was seen as an expeditious solution to this problem. The downsides would come later and would not be immediately obvious. But the mandates spread very, very quickly. Often, effectively kind of copied from one city's zoning code into the next. And it was acknowledged early on that there wasn't a lot of study going into these. We have here an image of a memo from the American Society of Planning Officials, which I believe evolved into today's American Planning Association. This is from February 1954, and the memo says, "It is doubtful if any two planners or architects could agree on the number of square feet of parking space required for a shopping center or individual store. There's a question in my mind if there ever will be a correct answer. My rule of thumb for providing parking space is to guess a number of stalls, and invariably I provide either too many or not enough. One of my clients who's made a study of parking believes that space should be provided for all the cars that go to a plaza or shopping center during the rush hour on the day before Christmas. Figure that one out." The memo literally says, figure that one out. This was not something that was deeply studied. A lot of parking requirements come from these manuals that are based on studies with one or two data points. The parking manual, the parking generation manual from the ITE, the Institute for Traffic Engineers, is the main one. It's often one or two data points. Almost always the parking studies were done in very suburban environments, so they don't translate to places where the rate of carpooling or the rate of transit use or walking or biking might not be the same. And ultimately, there's been this bias that's now baked into the codes toward we're going to make sure we never have a parking problem by mandating the maximum amount that we think we might ever need. Provide space for all the cars that go to a shopping center during the rush hour on the day before Christmas, or Black Friday, supposedly the biggest shopping day of the year for decades and decades. We're going to make sure we have enough parking for the maximum conceivable demand, and we're going to have spaces lying fallow the rest of the time. Um, the mandates get really, really granular, to the point of absurdity. You can pick out zoning codes. You can do this. These numbers are from North Carolina, but you can do this anywhere you want. A bowling alley. In Rocky Mount, you have to have 4 parking spaces per lane in the bowling alley. In Swansboro, it's 3. In Concord, it's 2. In Greensboro, North Carolina, it's 1 per 300 square feet. What basis is there to any of these numbers? It's extremely unclear, but you can find them in the code. I'm sure you could do this. I don't have the numbers for cities in Wisconsin, but you could do the same thing. 4 per lane, 5 per 1,000 square feet in Boone. Winston-Salem, you get even more kind of granular and absurd. 3 per alley, plus 1 per 100 square feet of gross floor area restaurant, plus 1 per employee on largest shift. Parking spaces for a laundromat. You can find a similar variety in requirements. 1 per 500 square feet, 1 per 200 square feet, 1 per employee plus 3 per customer. Like you get these things are written into local zoning codes, and they highlight the fundamental unscientific and arbitrariness of these rules that we don't actually know. At some point, somebody had a problem, and local planners attempted to resolve that problem by saying, we're going to make sure everyone provides enough parking, in this very linear way of thinking. Roughly right or precisely wrong? Would we rather be roughly right or precisely wrong? Parking mandates, wherever you see them, tend to be precisely wrong. We've got these numbers that look very authoritative to the point where, in development approval hearings, in front of planning commissions, in front of city councils, they will be, these numbers in the code will be cited as the authority on how much parking is necessary. Projects will be shut down because of these numbers that came from basically nowhere. Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a junkyard has to have 1 parking stall per 5,750 square feet. In SeaTac, Washington, a butterfly and moth breeding facility needs 1 parking stall per 250 square feet of office and retail area. Why do we have a specific requirement for a butterfly and moth breeding facility? I'm sure there's some historical reason. It's been lost to the sands of time. But this is the extreme kind of granularity and absurdity of these requirements in practice. So step 1 in making the case for parking reform is to expose the pseudoscience of parking requirements. And the pseudoscience creates these kind of laughable examples like a moth breeding facility. If it were just that these numbers aren't based in anything real, we could laugh at them. But it's not that. It's also that they do a lot of harm. These mandates in practice do a huge amount of harm. What are the big problems with parking mandates? What are the things that Donald Shoup described as the high costs of free parking, or we could say the high cost of too much parking? One is the literal financial cost of the parking itself. Parking is not free. Asphalt is not free. How much does a parking space cost? There are ranges. As a general rule of thumb, a surface lot is going to be upwards of $5,000 per stall to build. Structured parking, you're looking at $20,000, $40,000 per stall. When you get to an underground garage, which requires a lot more complicated engineering, you could be looking at $80,000 per parking stall. The ranges are broad, but it's significant amounts of money. It's a significant contributor to the overall cost of development, to residential space, to business space. And it gets factored into the ultimate consumer price is paid by those who are going to use that space, most notably rent for new housing. One study found that the cost of parking for a typical apartment building ends up increasing the construction costs such that that gets factored into rent at an extra $225 in monthly rent per parking space. That number it's going to be a range. It's going to vary by city. So that is an average over a number of cities in this study. There's a diagram here that shows some of the cities studied where Charlotte and Dallas on the cheaper end, where maybe more parking is surface parking. You get places like San Francisco and New York City where you're more likely to have structured parking, more complicated engineering. Those are on the high end. But over $200 in monthly rent, coming straight out of having to recoup the construction cost of that parking. And ultimately that's paid by the renter. And we see trade-offs in the use of public dollars as well. One really salient example from Stamford, Connecticut here. This slide has side-by-side images of a subsidized affordable housing complex in Stamford, and a public parking garage that was built in Stamford near the rail station where you can take the train into New York City. The parking garage cost $88,000 per stall for the city to build at public expense. So you have an $88,000 subsidy per car versus $77,000 in public subsidy per person to build that affordable housing. So in a time when we have a housing cost crisis and when we have very scarce subsidy dollars going into housing for the lowest income people, there are some direct trade-offs here in terms of government resources. The space that parking takes up is substantial, and it's substantial in a sneaky way where when you're living your day-to-day life, you don't always perceive the sheer extent of it. When you're driving from place to place, you don't perceive it in the way that you start to realize when you actually measure. This is a map that has made the rounds on the internet over a number of years. It's just a Google map of Los Angeles. Only somebody took an estimate of all of the surface parking in Los Angeles, which amounts to about 14% of the city's land area, and they aggregated it into one giant circle that you can see overlaid on the map. So if you somehow could magically take all of the surface parking in LA and assemble it into this kind of like blast radius, you would have a giant circle, sort of a parking impact crater, spanning most of the center of the city from downtown LA to Hollywood to Beverly Hills down to South LA. A massive amount of land in aggregate occupied by surface parking. We don't perceive it that way. We don't perceive the sheer impact. But you can start to see how it adds up when you look at what the actual ratios require for individual land uses. You can look at direct trade-offs between living space and parking space. A parking lot, when you include the drive aisles and the access point as opposed to just the stall itself, a parking space typically requires a little over 300 square feet, kind of at the bottom end of land. So you can fit a one-bedroom apartment in 600, 700 square feet very easily. We have an illustration here done by Alfred Twu, an illustrator out of California, where you have side by side that small apartment and two parking spaces that might very well be required for that apartment, occupying essentially the same amount of space. And in fact, we could size this up. There have been studies, I'm familiar with one in Kansas City, that found that more land in Kansas City is devoted to parking than to housing. We can see it for commercial uses. When the table in the code says that an office building requires one parking space per 300 square feet of office floor space, in practice, that means a parking lot that is at least as large as that building. When the code says a restaurant requires one parking space for every 2 1/2 seats, you can see that is a parking lot. In this example, it's a Burger King in the illustration I'm showing. That is a parking lot that is significantly larger than the building. Most commercial parking lots are actually larger than the building they serve, and you don't realize it when you're driving and parking in them. You realize it when you start to look at aerial photos. Think of the implications of this for a small business owner, an entrepreneur who wants to start up with very limited capital. They are at a huge disadvantage compared to a national chain like Burger King that can afford the overhead on day one of maintaining a very large parking lot and of buying all that land, having the necessary stormwater retention, the drive aisles, the other things that come with the parking. We have created a communication tool at PRN called the Parking Lot Map. It's based on OpenStreetMap, and it's an open source tool where you can go in and you can map all of the surface parking or the land that is dedicated to parking in your downtown, and then display it as sort of red highlighted areas on top of a neutral background, a white background. We host a number of these maps on our site. We've got about the 100 largest US cities covered. And we actually have a cohort of volunteers working right now on expanding the coverage of the parking lot map, because what it is it is a really, really powerful communication tool if you want to show people what the actual footprint of parking in their community is. You can instantly visualize the problem that parking poses for economic vitality, for housing, for business space, for all the things that actually make your downtown or your city worth visiting. We have on this slide, we have an example of the parking lot map applied to Houston, Texas, where 26% of the downtown central business district is devoted to parking. We can compare different cities to each other, and we see a range in terms of these parking ratios. There are cities that do better, there are cities that do worse. On average, 26% is about typical for a North American downtown. This is downtown. These are the places that actually probably have the least surface parking. If you go to a typical suburban shopping center or office complex, you are going to find much more than a quarter of the land occupied by parking. That is land that is essentially a liability. It's necessary because people do need to be able to drive and park, but it is land that is not creating any sort of urban vitality. It's not a place people want to linger, and it's not creating any tax base. It's not creating the revenue that allows your city to function. And the parking lot maps really dramatize that, essentially that dead weight, that drag on your city's prosperity and vitality. Here's the city center of Columbus, Ohio, illustrated on a slide. You can see massive amounts of parking, amounting to a huge share of the downtown. You can see it for Anchorage, Alaska. The same thing. As soon as you take that map and you turn on the layer that shows the parking, it just gets dotted with red all over the place. Again, these ratios are in the 30 to 40% range for these two cities. In Portland, Oregon, we're only at about 11% of the downtown devoted to surface parking lots. Portland, not coincidentally, was one of the earliest US cities to scale back and ultimately eliminate its parking mandates. Parking mandates create more traffic, and there are studies that show a really consistent direct relationship between these things. And part of that is that excessive parking perpetuates the need for itself. It essentially creates an urban environment that is extremely hostile to people who are not traveling in a car. Because one of the most miserable environments to have to traverse outside of a car is a parking lot or a sea of parking lots. Once you have the driving access to all these parking lots, you have a large number of curb cuts, which are conflict points. They are statistically extremely dangerous for pedestrians, for people using wheelchairs. You have an environment where it becomes very, very hostile to get from one business to another without driving a car. And so you start to get what a slide here I have from Smart Growth America illustrates as a very prototypical suburban environment where if you're running errands and you're making a few different trips, let's say you're gonna go to the bank, you're gonna shop for some clothes, you're gonna pick up groceries, you're gonna stop at a restaurant for dinner. Every one of those trips within the same stretch of the same road corridor now consists of driving and parking somewhere else. Whereas in a walkable urban environment, you might park once and then do all of those things on foot. But parking mandates spread out the productive uses in our city to the point where it becomes really, really onerous and unpleasant to do that. And they actually induce more driving at a very local level as a result. Here's another great visualization. This is from a social media account called Car Free America. But this is a grid of four different squares with illustrations. And in the top left, you have no parking required. And it's an illustration of a very traditional main street like you might find in small towns all over America, where you've got buildings right up to the sidewalk and right up against each other. Um, Once you start requiring parking, it is impossible geometrically to have that pattern. So at a ratio of one space per 500 square feet, which is a pretty modest parking requirement by most commercial standards in America, now you have sort of a strip mall type building with a parking lot on the corner. The sidewalk is now separated from the actual destination by this little moat of parking and by a driveway, by a curb cut where people are turning in and out. So you've already created an environment that is very, very degraded for anyone who's not in a car. At one space per 250 square feet, now you're at the point where significantly more of the landscape is devoted to parking than to actual buildings. And in the bottom right of this grid, at one space per 100 square feet, that's the kind of ratio you start to see in environments where you have like drive-through restaurants. The majority of the land is parking. It is extremely hostile to travel by walking, by biking, by wheelchair. You have created an overall landscape where car dependency is now perpetuating itself, and generating the need for all that parking in the first place. And that's the way in which ultimately more parking means more traffic. That you can't view this in a linear way. Well, we have parking requirements because people in our community drive cars and they need a place to park. That's not untrue, but it is a simplification because we are creating a self-perpetuating outcome when we have codes that make it almost impossible to build the kind of place where it is viable and convenient and pleasant and safe to travel without a car. And all this driving has massive environmental impacts. You can look at different regions of the world in terms of carbon emissions from transportation. And a lot of studies have been done on this. And the USA is an extreme outlier. To a lesser extent, North America, Australia, New Zealand, but the USA, even compared to those other countries, walks away with it. Almost double the passenger transport carbon emissions. That's kilograms per person per year from private transport of any other region in the world. And this is a direct function of car dependency. And one of the linchpins of car dependency is parking mandates. Asphalt parking lots contribute to the urban heat island effect. Here is a graphic from a study that was done in Portland, Oregon, where you can see huge variation within the city in the surface temperature. As heat waves become more and more common and affect more and more parts of our country, this is also something where the impacts of our dependency on parking are really, really far reaching. Let's get to a couple of the objections to parking reform, or what this slide calls the tough stuff. One that you hear a lot is equity concerns. And I think that these are fundamentally well-meaning. I think they come from a good place. The concern, if I could paraphrase it, is, or as this graphic I'm showing paraphrases it, charging for parking hurts the poor. You know, we have people whose lives are tough enough, and now we're going to ask them, we're going to make parking more scarce, and we're going to ask them to pay for parking where it used to be free. We're going to rent apartments to them that don't have a parking space, and then they're going to have to find and arrange and pay for their own parking. Aren't we making life harder for the poorest people? I think we need to take a more holistic view of the issue. And one answer to that is that there are actually a whole lot of low-income people who don't drive cars or don't own cars. And in fact, statistically, low-income people are by far the most likely income group to not use a car. And so there are also equity impacts to reinforcing a transportation system that is really, really onerous and downright unsafe for people who don't use cars. I think that is one sort of complicating factor of that critique. And other things that low-income people depend on, such as affordable housing, become more costly and more scarce and harder to provide when you have policies demanding an excess of parking. When you look at parking ratios for rental housing, the lowest parking utilization is almost invariably in subsidized low-income housing. And the greatest oversupply tends to be in those buildings where parking is a significant cost barrier to their creation in the first place. A holistic approach to equity in transportation needs to acknowledge that there are people who are dependent on their car and that a car can be a lifeline. It can be a means of accessing jobs, especially in regions that don't have great alternatives right now to driving. Um, but that ultimately, holistically, the cost of car ownership and maintenance is an enormous ante to participation in society in car dependent places. And it's a huge burden on the people who can afford it least. And when we take that holistic look, what we see here, this is a graph. It's like a two-dimensional graph with axes. And the x-axis is percent of income going toward housing, and the y-axis is percent of income towards transportation. The source of this came out of a study that was released by HUD a few years ago. But different metro areas are plotted at different points. It's a scatter plot on this graph. And what you can see is that you can kind of separate it into quadrants. Um, there are regions that have maybe less affordable housing, but more affordable transportation, such as New York City, such as San Francisco, Washington, D.C. There are regions that are known for their affordable housing, such as Houston or Dallas, where the cost of transportation is a much more significant burden for residents, because things tend to be very spread out. You tend to drive very long distances. Um, there are different cities that fall at different points on this graph, but these trade-offs really do exist. One of the most powerful things that you can do in terms of cost of living for low-income people is to simply make it possible for a family to go from two cars to one, where we don't even have to talk about one car to zero. Can you make it possible for a family that needed two cars to survive to function just fine with one by adjusting your land use patterns, by adjusting your transportation network? There are a lot of things that have to happen to make that feasible, to make that individual lifestyle switch feasible. But eliminating parking mandates and inducements for excess parking, that's absolutely part of the picture here. Another objection we get is, but the transit isn't good enough. As long as people are dependent on cars right now because we don't have good alternatives, we need parking mandates. There's a chicken egg aspect to this critique. The reality is that as you have a greater concentration of people living in a place, as you have a density of residents, of businesses, of destinations, you build the support. You build a political base of support for improvements to public transit. You increase the viability of actually running high frequency transit, the kind that is useful for people as a substitute for driving. And you increase the potential revenue to fund that transit. So there's not one answer to the kind of chicken and egg dilemma here. There are a lot of places that could really use public transit improvements to make, again, we don't have to talk about not driving at all. It doesn't need to be cut and dry, but to make driving less or owning fewer cars an option for households. I don't think we can afford, if we want to get there, to put on hold one of the most important land use changes that might actually make that possible. Because as long as we have arbitrary parking mandates on the books, we are not going to get the concentrations of people that allow for a walkable destination that can be well served by public transit. Electric cars will save us is another objection we hear. And to some extent, maybe that does answer the environmental objections to car dependency and to high rates of driving and parking. But it doesn't answer the other objections. It does not answer the fundamental geometry issue that I've tried to highlight in this talk, because at the end of the day, an electric car is still a car. It still takes up the same amount of space. It requires a parking spot. When you think about mandates that are starting to be politically on the table in a lot of places for electric charging stations, especially at apartment buildings, an electric charger mandate is effectively a parking mandate. Electric cars are good. This is not a knock on the technology. But there are issues around the individual reliance, the dependency on a private motor vehicle for every trip that are not resolved by electric cars. So our mission, I talked about this at the beginning. This is the same slide I showed at the beginning. Parking Reform Network's mission is to build and sustain the parking reform movement. And I want to get now, I've talked about the problems with excess parking, the problems with parking mandates. I want to talk about the movement, because this is something where we are really in the middle of a sea change in the US. Eliminating minimum parking mandates is snowballing in popularity. Um, I have a graph here. This is from the Sightline Institute. I'm actually going to critique the graph in my own slide here because it has 2015 as the first year in which a US or Canadian city repealed parking mandates. And I have to admit, I don't know which city that's referring to. So I will be correcting this slide for a future talk, or at least getting to the bottom of what that is. To the best of my knowledge, the first two, at least larger US cities to completely do away with parking mandates were Buffalo and Hartford, and that was in 2016. In any case, we have seen this reform absolutely snowball to the point where we now are aware of 88 cities and towns that have done this, and many, many more that have scaled back these mandates, either for certain geographies or certain uses, have taken incremental steps toward this kind of parking reform. This is not just a big city issue. It's not just an issue in places where there is robust public transit. We are seeing mid-sized cities do it, such as South Bend, Indiana, or Duluth, Minnesota. We are seeing small towns do it, such as Lansing, Kansas, Port Townsend, Washington, Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Often in small towns, the reform is driven not by concerns about car dependency or getting people out of cars or promoting alternatives, but by really tangible examples of the harm done by parking mandates. One of the anecdotes that I'm most familiar with is Sandpoint, Idaho, which is a tourist town in the northern Idaho Panhandle of about 2,000 people. And in 2007, a bank in downtown Sandpoint went to renovate its building, and the renovation triggered the city's parking mandates. They had previously been kind of grandfathered in. Well, now they had to comply with the parking code, and that meant that they had to expand their parking lot from 110 stalls to over 200. To do that, this bank bought up two adjacent buildings that were home to beloved local businesses. One of them was a coffee shop, and they tore them down. And outraged residents started writing to their city council member and saying, what was this all about? Why did this happen? And 2 years later, the city council voted to abolish all parking mandates in downtown Sandpoint. This kind of story is really, really common, especially in smaller towns where the trade-off between parking and the Main Street environment that is historic, that everyone loves, that people see as the soul of the community, that trade-off can become really, really obvious. This is our map. You can see we've been working diligently. We have volunteers working all the time to highlight cities and towns that have reduced their parking mandates. So every yellow dot on this map, and you can see dots in just about every US state. I actually don't see a single state that is missing here. So there's at least one dot in every US state for a city that has eliminated its parking mandates in at least its city center or a certain district. And as I said, 88 cities that have done away with them completely. What happens when cities undertake this reform? A bunch of good things become possible. Vacant buildings get new life. This is an image of a restaurant and brewery called Feed and Folly in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Fayetteville did away with its downtown parking requirement in 2015. And it has resulted in a bunch of flourishing new local businesses in the historic downtown core, in the part of the town that was initially built and planned prior to mass car ownership, and where buildings had been lying fallow, in part because entrepreneurs couldn't make occupying that vacant building, that historic space, work and also comply with the parking requirement. And the city planner, when I was working at Strong Towns, we interviewed him, and he told us the buildings I had identified as being perpetually and perhaps permanently unusable were very quickly purchased, redeveloped, and are in use right now. This is an example of the power of parking reform. You get better use of existing parking because you have inducements toward actually using parking that is lying underused or vacant, such as an oversized garage devoted to office uses that is never being fully used. In this example, I need to look at my notes. I'm sorry, this is Hartford. Okay. Hartford, Connecticut was one of the first cities to abolish their mandates. And what you're looking at here is a project in Hartford restored two vacant commercial buildings into over 250 new apartments with no parking. And so residents started renting out space in this adjacent garage, which had a huge amount of empty parking, unused parking. They started paying a monthly rate to use that parking. So the market is kind of resolving any concern about a shortage, any concern about, well, what about people who still need a car? Um, we've seen the same thing. These are photos I took in Sarasota, Florida, where I used to live. Keeping Sarasota in my thoughts today because they're about to get hammered by a hurricane. But what has happened in Sarasota's downtown is that a bunch of private parking lots belonging to individual businesses, such as a law firm or a gym, they are now using a middleman company to rent out that space when the business is not open to anyone else who wants to pay a few dollars to park there. And this was triggered by some parking reforms, both in terms of the mandates for off-street use, but also the city implementing paid metered parking on street. What happens is you start to recognize that the space you're using to park cars, that free parking isn't really free. That space has a value and it has a cost. It has an opportunity cost. And once you establish that in policy, you see the market start to fill in solutions to more efficiently provide parking to those who need it, but to no longer over provide it, resulting in all this dead space in our communities. You get more housing. Seattle and Buffalo, after their parking reforms, found that the majority of new homes permitted were in buildings that would have been illegal under the prior code because they have no parking or they have less parking. 59% of permitted housing units in Seattle fit that description, 68% in Buffalo. Most buildings still do include parking. Eliminate parking mandates does not mean eliminate parking. So in the same study, what they found was that Seattle in the last few years, since the eliminating mandates, 70% of new developments still have off-street parking. In Buffalo, it's 83. This is residential development. So apartment building owners are responding to the market. They're responding to the reality that most of their tenants do have cars and they are providing parking, but it's a market correction. They're providing parking in actual concordance with what they know they need and not an arbitrary mandate. So in the case of Seattle, this reform, a study found that the parking reform specifically legalized 35,000 new homes, or over 9% of Seattle's current housing stock. A study in Minneapolis finds that since parking requirements were reduced and then eliminated in the city, reduced in 2015, eliminated in 2021, Minneapolis is building systematically less parking in new residential buildings, with an average ratio falling from about one parking spot per housing unit to significantly less, to about 0.7, 0.8, depending on the building. And you can look at a graph here. This shows sort of bell curve density distributions of parking per unit because some buildings are going to have more, some buildings are going to have less. What you see is a gradual shift over time as new apartment buildings, now the range of the amount of parking that they provide has shifted toward less parking per unit. And in particular, the number of new buildings built in Minneapolis with no parking whatsoever has increased significantly. That's the left tail of the graph that you see here. It's still a minority. Most buildings have parking, but we have freed up developers to respond to actual market demand and not an arbitrary baseless mandate in the code. And this creates opportunities for real people. This is Veronica, who now owns a home in Seattle that was built by Habitat for Humanity. Veronica has never owned a car. This created an affordable housing option for her. In Oregon, statewide parking reform, mandating that most cities above a certain size do away with their parking requirements for residential use. This has allowed new affordable housing options. This is a building in Troutdale that wouldn't have been legal under the prior code. This is another one. This is a local architect, Gene Templeton, revised his plans for a small apartment building to get rid of the off-street parking spaces and add 4 more homes instead. It becomes possible with parking reform to do small-scale infill, to build multifamily housing on residential lots. It is almost impossible to do things like this small apartment building, or even as simple as putting a backyard cottage in your backyard. If you are required to provide a brand new parking space for that cottage, on most urban lots, you can't do it. With parking reform, you can. This is Melissa Bruce. She operates a small residential healthcare facility in Beaverton, Oregon, for seniors who can't care for themselves, often those who have late-stage dementia or Parkinson's. So none of her residents are able to drive. But nonetheless, the city of Beaverton denied her permit to expand her facility over 2 parking spaces that they said she required. She went back after Oregon required cities to abolish their residential parking mandates, and she started the permit process all over again. We haven't seen the results yet, but parking reform opens up opportunities that didn't exist for us to meet the needs of our communities. Parking reform is like removing a bunch of rocks and debris from a garden. In and of itself, it doesn't plant anything, but it makes it possible to grow good things. Tony, my colleague and the founder of PRN, spoke with the planning manager of Pasco, Washington, a few months ago, who said, Pasco is growing so much. This is a suburb of Portland. Pasco is growing so much, it's like building a whole nother city on top of the one that is already there. And so really the question here that I'll leave you with is if you have to build a whole city over again, would you want to do it the same way? If you think about the historic development pattern that we had in this country prior to the introduction of parking mandates, prior to mass auto ownership, those are some of our most beloved places, some of our most productive and prosperous and active places. And our zoning codes essentially guarantee that we can't build the way we used to. Parking reform is a crucial linchpin in making it so we can. I will stop there. I think I went a little bit over the time I had hoped to talk, so my apologies for that. I would love to take some Q&A. I've got my last slide up. Just our website is parkingreform.org, and a lot of our resources, including the different map tools, the crowdsourced things that I told you about, are available there. And my email address is daniel@parkingreform.org. I can take whatever questions you all have time for now, and I'm also happy to respond to any and all inquiries by email.
Thank you so much. Virtual hand clap for Daniel. I'm gonna, oh, yeah, okay. I'm gonna open up the chat. So if y'all have questions to put in the chat, we can also use the hand raise feature. So while you're thinking of questions for Daniel, I want to take the opportunity to introduce my colleague, Carl Glazemeyer. Wave, Carl, who is my counterpart in Milwaukee. And Carl first got me connected with Parking Reform Network. So special shout out to them. Carl's our transportation policy director and does a lot of work in Milwaukee. Oh man, you do a lot of stuff related to opposing highway expansions and supporting zoning reforms that would increase density and make housing more affordable. And Carl, I'm just going to put you on the spot. Do you know if parking reform is part of that zoning work in Milwaukee?
Good question. It was proposed to be part of the plan that the city would remove parking mandates. However, the right now the city's holding off on that, and they're looking to institute changes on what's allowed from a housing standpoint, and they'll revisit parking in the future.
Okay. Yeah, it can be contentious. I don't see hands raised, and I did see one comment in the chat, super interesting and informative presentation, but I don't see any questions. So do you all have questions? Don't be shy. I know this group always has good questions. Well, while you're thinking, maybe I'll get us started. So I'm familiar with a lot of this work because I'm familiar with parking reform. And I've also read the book Paved Paradise by Henry Grabar, which I highly recommend. I did assign a chapter of that to the Academy participants for this week. But one thing that really sticks out to me just from reading that book and also just from paying attention to what's happening in the community around me, people get very upset at the prospect of losing parking spaces. There was even a study that came out of UW Milwaukee. Maybe you're familiar with this, Carl, where Bob Schneider and a couple other people did a study on like people's emotional responses to or like how they felt about parking on campus at UW Milwaukee, and the prevailing emotion that they registered from this survey was anger, because nobody wanted to have to pay for it. Nobody felt like there was enough. Everybody thought they were entitled to get a parking space. So I'm just Daniel, what is your reaction to that? Does Parking Reform Network look at how to deal with the anger that tends to come from these changes that are proposed in different cities?
Yeah, absolutely. And that anger is real. I think one thing we try to do a lot of is, connect. I mean, through connecting advocates who have dealt with these issues in a variety of communities, they can share what messaging worked. How did you genuinely respond to these concerns? What concerns were you hearing? Because one thing we know is that when the issue is presented without trade-offs, people do respond in this gut way. Like, if you simply asked, I think the average American, what is your opinion of free parking? They would say, yeah, it sounds great. I like to park for free. There should be a lot of it. There should always be a parking space anywhere I want to go when I want to go there. That seems obvious. If the question is presented without trade-offs, in the same sense as like, would you like, lower taxes and higher government services and a free puppy and ice cream for everyone? Like, I mean, not to belittle the genuine concerns that people have, but often it's coming from a place of, yeah, I'm used to taking this thing for granted, and I don't see what it is that I don't have because of this thing. So you can highlight that for people, and it starts to change minds. But it's also true that, and we see this more and more as places do enact parking reform, for those who are worried about losing access to parking, it doesn't happen. The sky doesn't fall. The results I showed from Minneapolis kind of speak to that what you get is a lot of apartment buildings built with the amount of parking they actually need instead of far more than they need. You get small businesses able to open and their customers park on the street nearby or in a lot nearby, where in the past that small business wouldn't have existed. Because they couldn't afford a parking lot or they didn't have the space for one. They couldn't afford to demolish the building next door to build one. So I think you highlight those trade-offs for people, combined with a certain amount of reassurance that the actual changes that result from these reforms are gradual and incremental.
All right. Quiet group today. Any questions? Steve, I see your hand up.
Okay. My dream is to be a Shupian. And so actually I am Audible, so I actually downloaded the high cost of free parking. And so I'll listen to it every day in the car looking for parking. I'm just kidding. But it'll be my, book on tape, whatever, as I'm listening to it every day to work. And I also became a member of of your group, the PR. And so that's so I guess my dream is coming true of being a Shupian. But great presentation, like I said, very informative and fun. It was easy to watch and a lot of great information. And the maps with all the red and everything's actually kind of scary. Because I used to live in Houston, and to see how bad it really is. Wow, I never realized how much parking there was downtown. Crazy. And as far as free parking and things, I live in Racine, which is just north of Kenosha. And the one thing that everyone hates in downtown Racine is you have to pay for parking. And everyone wishes that one night as somebody would come and knock all the parking meters over and they'd all go away, because they say that actually deters people from going down there and going to the restaurants and things because of the free parking. no free parking. So anyway, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. I love to hear that feedback on the presentation. I will make my quick obligatory pitch for membership. PRN is a membership-based organization, and you can find that info on our website at parkingreform.org. Membership just means making a financial donation of any amount, and that gets you access to our Slack, which is where a lot of the community discussion and organizing happens, access to exclusive webinars and events. And we do provide scholarships for anyone who wants to be a member, but maybe they're a student or a researcher or financially strapped. And there's instructions on the website to contact us in that circumstance.
I'm just going to call on Marty because I see Marty's hand is up, and then we'll go to the questions in the chat.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, we can. Go
okay.
ahead.
All right. Yeah, I've had trouble in the past, so I didn't know. Okay. I thought it was kind of interesting that they couldn't nail it down more precisely how many parking spaces there are compared to how many people there are. When you said it was like could be as many as 3 parking spaces or as many as 8 parking spaces per person, not per car. I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, it's there's just not a good accounting of it.
And then the city mandates of the silly rules for number of parking spaces. Yeah, that's definitely got to change. Got to study that a little closer.
One of the best cases you can make against parking mandates, just when talking with a skeptic, is that it's not even about we need less driving, we need fewer cars, we need less land devoted to parking. You can make all those arguments, but you can also simply observe that there is no real credible case for saying that your city planners and their zoning code, that they know better exactly how much parking every little granular specific type of business needs than the actual owner of the business knows.
Yeah. And I like the idea of the fallow parking spaces that aren't being used throughout the year, but the one day of the year, the Black Friday at the mall or whatever. It's kind of like the same thing with downtown Kenosha, the 4th of July celebration. The whole downtown is just packed full of cars. You can't move, and the rest of the year, it's like,
yeah. But I mean, you can think, I think everybody can think of an example of a place they've been to or an event they've been to where it was really, really hard to park. Probably had a really good time, because the fact that it was really, really hard to park was probably an indicator that you were going to something that was really worthwhile.
Well, that's what I always tell people that say, I don't like crowds, I don't like going to concerts or whatever. And I would say, well, if it's something worth doing, a lot of people are going to want to do it. That's what...
just for the sake of the recording, I'm going to read the questions aloud from the chat. So the first one's from Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. I'm glad you could come. Structured parking is a tricky thing to calculate in terms of cost per stall. What about calculating the cost per net new parking space in a parking ramp when compared to a surface lot? Say, for example, a 250 stall ramp is built on a 100 stall surface parking lot. Shouldn't we focus on the cost per stall of creating the 150 new stalls? The cost per new stall might be 20 times that of a surface stall. Jeremy is a very well-educated person and also serves on the Eau Claire City Council. So I think this question is coming from a very informed place.
Right. I think the answer to that, I mean, not to kind of cop out, I think it depends on what you're calculating it for. But in the case of, are we taking an existing parking lot and are we redeveloping it? And the context in which the numbers I was presenting around structured parking were for residential uses where you're probably building on a site where, I mean, who knows what was there before, but it wasn't parking serving apartment tenants. So it was more of in the function of like, what is the total development cost of this building, and how does that get capitalized into the rent that your tenants are paying, or the minimum rent that you can charge to make the building viable in the first place. And in that context, it seems like the cost per new stall might be the relevant number, but I think your point is well taken. It's really what you're using the number for and what you're trying to convey.
The next question is from Sam. What future trends do you predict for land use planning? Are smaller communities moving in the right direction?
I think that our reform map is testament to the fact that many, many communities are moving in the right direction. Um, and not just in terms of parking reform, but in broader land use planning, I think we're in the middle of sort of a reevaluation of a lot of longstanding practices, from really rigid single-use zoning to single-family zoning that doesn't allow for any other kind of housing in most of our developed area. Um, the housing crisis in particular has spurred a lot of cities and towns to reevaluate some of these longstanding practices. So, yeah, I think a lot of places are moving in the right direction. I think we do see it in smaller communities, and we see it in places that aren't, to put it simply, they're not New York, they're not Chicago. Um, it's not just being driven by sort of an urbanist or an anti-car ideology, which I think is the way people sometimes sort of caricature it. Um, but by how can we meet real practical needs of our residents and create a better place?
Kelly asks, are there numbers around how much subsidized parking costs versus how much a public transit systems cost? Or is transit perhaps cheaper than all the costs of all the parking we have? That's a great question.
That is a great question. I don't have an immediate great answer to that great question. And actually, I am saving that question. I am jotting that down to look into because I'm interested in having a better answer to that. I have seen, I don't know how to answer that. I've seen, maybe answers to some of those questions in isolation. I've seen estimates of the total cost of parking subsidy on a nationwide basis. Some of those estimates are in Shoup's book. And the 2005 estimate, which I'm sure is out of date at this point, was 127 billion per year in subsidy to Americans in the form of free or subsidized parking or mandated parking. So, and the book goes into great detail about how that number's arrived at. So there are kind of pieces of this puzzle you can get at from different actions, but that angles. But that direct comparison is not one I've seen. And I think it would be challenging to get at, but I'd be curious. Again, I'm jotting down the question because I'd love to actually look into that and get back to you with some version of an answer.
I think that's a great question because you're talking about competing land use to some extent, and
Yeah.
the way, like, I'm just going to interject my opinion here, that the way we see driving as free and something we are all entitled to be able to do, versus generally speaking, we tend to see public transit as like this. A lot of people tend to see it as this expensive nuisance, right? Like this thing that's costing us. And actually the two things are related.
Yeah.
What is costing us and what are we losing by having driving as the default.
Right. You really need to think about it as a mobility system, which is transportation and land use in one. I can think of two studies I've seen, and I can look up the links to these to follow up with later. One was done in Canada in the Ottawa region, and it was a comparison of the public service costs associated with prototypical suburban development versus urban development. And they found that sort of the overall costs were significantly higher for the suburban development pattern. And that was encompassing infrastructure, water, sewer, services like police, fire. I've also seen a study that looks at the share of income going to transportation in the US versus Europe. Europe, which tends to have more transit ridership, more walkable communities, some lower mode share for individual driving. And what they found was that in the US, the share of your income that goes to transportation decreases as you move up in income bracket. So the lowest income quintile in the US is paying the highest percentage of their income on transportation. And in Europe, the trend goes the other direction. So there's a real powerful equity implication there. And that has to do with what I called in my talk the ante of car ownership. And so I think there are some superficial discussions you get of the cost of public transit that go like, well, look, transit is every ride is subsidized by this many cents and this many dollars, and only 10% or only 15% of the cost of running the transit system is recovered at the fare box, and roads are far more efficient. And what's missing from that analysis is car dependent land use patterns that put transit at a massive, massive disadvantage in terms of moving people, that basically create the conditions where we have to travel huge numbers of miles to do what we do in our life. And then say, well, the cost of providing all those roads and all that parking for people to travel all those miles somehow looks like a bargain compared to the cost of serving these people in this incredibly spread out landscape with really dispersed destinations with efficient public transit. Well, the land use pattern creates the playing field on which transit looks inefficient. So I think that's really, really important to which doesn't answer any question about what's the statistic, what's the soundbite I can quote. But when you think about it holistically as a system, and you look at what are the private costs that we are forcing households to incur, what are the public sector costs associated with the mobility system, then you arrive at different answers from the ones that some people are throwing out there.
Yeah,
Sorry
I
if that
think that's
was
no, that's all right. I think that's a good way to frame it because, in the housing crisis, we hear a lot about that housing burden, how it shouldn't be more than 30% of your income, but for low income people, it's often a much higher burden. And we hear about that with energy burden too. That's an issue in, all over Wisconsin, but we're hearing a lot about it in Milwaukee in particular because the rate hikes are going up. So I think that framing it in terms of transportation burden and I think that I think is something that would resonate with people. We are past 5, so if anybody has any burning questions, this is the time to ask. I'm going to give it to the count of 5. Okay, I guess that's that. So thank you so much, Daniel. I'm going to stop the recording.